Listen, a 5-year-old girl walked past 6 armed men and into a room that hadn't seen sunlight in 7 years. She pointed at a wheelchair folded in the corner like forgotten furniture. She said 3 words. "Catch me, mister." The man in that bed hadn't stood, hadn't spoken, hadn't so much as turned his head toward a doorway in 7 long years. They called him the Snow Wolf of Koreatown. Dragons and tigers inked from his knuckles to his collarbone, a face carved from stone. The most feared boss the Lee Syndicate ever produced, rotting behind blackout curtains in a Bel Air mansion built to hide him from the world. Dr. Naomi Twinkers never wanted to walk through that gate. She was a black pediatric neurorehab specialist, 30-something, widowed, drowning in $250,000 of debt she didn't know her husband left behind. One contract, one NDA with a death clause. And one little girl in yellow overalls she had no choice but to bring with her that morning. Naomi thought she was there to read a chart and leave. Her daughter had other plans. Annabelle Twinkers slipped past the guards, pushed open a door marked forbidden, and looked at the deadliest man in Lowe's Angels like he was just another kid on the playground. Something cracked in that room, and somewhere in that mansion, a clock started counting down. Before we go further, if you believe no parent should ever have their child taken away by corrupt power, hit that subscribe button right now. Comment, Annabelle, below if you're ready to watch a mob boss meet his match in a 5-year-old. And drop a like if you're already rooting for Naomi and Yehoon before we've even gotten to the good part. Annabelle didn't run. She didn't hide. She stood in that doorway for 3 full seconds looking at a man wrapped in shadows and tattoos, and then she smiled at him the way she smiled at everybody, like the world hadn't taught her yet that some rooms are dangerous. Naomi didn't know any of this was happening. She was still down the hall, signing her name for the 4th time that morning, a pen shaking slightly in her hand though she'd never admit it. The estate manager, a thin man named Preston with a clipboard and a voice like a closing door, had walked her through the contract line by line. Confidentiality, liability waivers. A penalty clause with a number so large, it made her stomach drop, even though she'd already read it twice online, before she ever got dressed that day. "Dr. Twinkers," Preston had said, sliding the final page toward her, "you understand this contract is binding for the full duration of treatment. There is no early termination clause." She understood. She understood the way a woman understands water rising past her ankles in a house she can't afford to leave. $250,000. That was the number sitting on top of her husband's grave like a headstone nobody asked for. Predatory loans, forged signatures, a financial trap she hadn't even known existed until the collection letters started arriving 6 months after the funeral, when she was still setting 2 coffee cups out of habit some mornings. This contract could end it. 1 patient, 1 case. Enough money to make the debt disappear and keep the roof over Annabelle's head. She'd told herself that in the car, gripping the steering wheel at every red light on the way up into the hills, watching the houses get bigger and the gates get taller and the whole world start to feel like it belonged to somebody else. She had not expected to bring her daughter into it. The daycare call that morning had cut through her like a blade, burst pipe, closed indefinitely, "So sorry, Dr. Twinkers," and there had been no one else to call. No family close enough, no favor left to ask. So she'd buckled Annabelle into the back seat, promised her a coloring book and 15 quiet minutes, and driven up into Bel Air praying the mansion would have some sterile waiting room where a 5-year-old in yellow overalls could sit and be forgotten for an hour. There was no waiting room. There was only a hallway, dim and cold despite the June heat outside, lined with men who didn't speak and didn't smile and kept their hands resting near their belts like it was reflex. The security contract required a blood sample, a background check, and a non-disclosure agreement with a death clause, and Naomi had signed all of it without letting her hand shake, because that's what you do when you're the only parent left and the bills don't care how scared you are. "She stays here," Preston had said, nodding toward Annabelle, seated on a bench with her toy car and her crooked pink bows. "Don't let her wander. Mr. Lee's condition requires absolute quiet." Naomi had believed him. She'd looked her daughter in the eye and said the thing every mother says, "Stay right there. Baby, Mommy will be 5 minutes," and Annabelle had nodded, already more interested in the swirl pattern of the marble floor than in the promise itself. 5 minutes, That's all it took. Naomi was 3 doors down, reviewing a medical chart so thin it barely qualified as one. No imaging, no lab work, no physician's notes past the first 18 months, just a single line repeated in different handwriting over 7 years. No change when she heard it. Not a scream. Not an alarm. Just the low murmur of men shifting on their feet, followed by silence so complete it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. She dropped the chart and ran. What she found stopped her cold in the hallway before she even reached the doorway. 6 armed men stood frozen, not moving, not speaking, staring into a room that had been sealed and silent for 7 years, a room she'd been told, in no uncertain terms, she wasn't cleared to enter without an escort. And past all of them, past the men whose job it was to guard the most feared man in the Lee syndicate, stood her daughter. Small, fearless, standing at the foot of a bed like it was nothing at all. Naomi's first instinct wasn't fear of Yi-hoon. It was fear of what these men might do to a 5-year-old who'd wandered somewhere she wasn't allowed to be. She'd read enough, in the hour she'd had to prepare, to know that men like this didn't tolerate mistakes, and mistakes didn't usually get a second chance. Annabelle, her voice came out sharper than she meant it, cracking down the marble hallway. Annabelle, come here right now. Nobody moved. Not the guards, not her daughter. Not, Naomi would realize a half-second later, the man in the bed. She pushed past a guard who didn't stop her. Later, she'd wonder why none of them stopped her. And what she saw in that doorway rearranged something in her chest permanently. The room was dark, curtains sealed against daylight the way a wound is sealed against air. And in the center of it, propped against a mountain of pillows he clearly hadn't needed in years, was Lee Yi-hoon. Even in the dim light, she could make out the ink dragons curling up one forearm, a tiger's face half hidden beneath a hospital gown that looked wrong on a man built like a monument. His face was gaunt in a way that spoke of years, not illness. His eyes, when they found Naomi standing frozen in the doorway, held something she hadn't expected. Not menace, not the cold blankness the chart implied, something closer to shock. Because Annabelle Twinkers was standing at the foot of his bed, hands on her hips, grinning up at him like he was the last kid picked for a game she fully intended to organize herself. "You're slow," Annabelle said, matter of fact, the way only a 5-year-old can deliver an insult and a compliment in the same breath. "I bet I can beat you to the door." Nobody in that room answered her. Nobody in that room, Naomi would learn, had heard Yi-hoon's voice in 7 years. And for one unbearable electric second, nothing happened at all. Naomi stepped forward, already reaching for her daughter, already rehearsing the apology she'd owe Preston, and whoever owned this house, and whatever version of her career she still had left after this. And that's when she noticed something that made her stop reaching and start looking instead. The IV line running into Yi-hoon's arm wasn't hooked to a single bag like she'd expect for a man this many years post-injury. It was hooked to 3, unlabeled. And on the chart, she dropped 3 doors down, in 7 years of no change. There wasn't a single note about what those 3 bags actually contained. She didn't have time to ask. Because Lee Yi-hoon, silent for 7 years, still for 7 years, given up on by 7 years of doctors who'd walked through that door and never come back a second time, turned his head, slow and deliberate, toward the little girl standing fearlessly at the foot of his bed. And he spoke. One word, rough, dry, barely a whisper after 7 years of disuse, but a word unmistakably, and every guard in that hallway heard it at the same time Naomi did. And every guard in that hallway understood, in that instant, that something in this house had just changed forever. Before we go any further into what happened next, because trust me, what Yi-hoon said in that room is going to break something open in this story we can't take back. I want to talk to you about something close to my heart. If Naomi's story is speaking to you, if you know what it feels like to carry a weight nobody sees and keep showing up anyway, I want to put something in front of you. It's called Stories That Make You Feel Something, 2 full novels, one that will break your heart and one that will heal it. Love and loss and hope all wrapped into the kind of stories you don't just watch, you live inside of. It comes with a free audiobook, future books included, and it's ready for instant download right now. The link is in the description and pinned in the comments below. And if you're watching this on your TV tonight, just grab your phone, open the camera, and scan the QR code right there on your screen. It'll take you straight to it. Go on. You've earned a story that feels like this one. The word was race. It hung in the stale, sealed air of that room for a full second before anyone moved, and Naomi would remember for the rest of her life the way it landed. Not loud, not dramatic, just a single cracked syllable dragged up from somewhere 7 years deep, like a man clawing his way back to the surface of his own life. Rough, dry, barely more than breath shaped into sound, but real, unmistakably, undeniably real. And in that room, full of grown men trained to kill without blinking, nobody breathed. Naomi's hand was still stretched toward her daughter, still frozen mid-reach, when she understood what she was witnessing. This wasn't a mistake to apologize for. This wasn't a 5-year-old wandering somewhere she shouldn't be. This was something none of these guards, none of the previous doctors, none of the 7 years of silence had managed to do, and her baby girl had done it in under a minute, standing there in yellow overalls with her hands on her hips like she owned the room. The snow wolf of Lowe's angels hadn't uttered a sound since the night of the explosion. Naomi didn't know that yet. Not the details, not the fire, not the 7 years of no change, scrawled across a chart by men who'd stopped trying to understand what they were looking at. All she knew, standing in that doorway with her heart slamming against her ribs, was that the guards behind her had gone rigid, hands tightening on weapons they hadn't drawn yet but clearly wanted to, as if a miracle in this house was somehow still a threat that needed containing. "Ma'am," one of them closest to the door found his voice first, low and urgent. "Ma'am, you need to get your daughter out of." "Wait!" The word came out of Naomi before she'd decided to say it, her palm lifting instinctively, the same gesture she used on nervous parents in 100 rehab sessions when things were about to go sideways, and everyone in the room needed to just breathe for 1 second. She wasn't thinking about the NDA anymore, or the death clause, or the $250,000 riding on her keeping this job. She was thinking like a clinician now, the only language that had ever made her feel steady when the ground gave out beneath her. "Wait, don't move, please just wait." Because Annabelle wasn't backing away from the man in the bed. She was leaning in. "You said a word," Annabelle informed him, delighted, like he'd finally caught up to a conversation she'd been having with him the whole time. "I heard it. You said race." Yi-hoon's eyes, dark, hollow-set, ringed with the particular exhaustion of a man who has stopped expecting anything from his own body, moved from the little girl's face down to his own hand resting on the silk sheet. And Naomi watched it happen. She watched his fingers twitch. Small. Involuntary at first, then not, a slow, deliberate curling of 2 fingers against the fabric. A voluntary motion no doctor had documented in nearly a decade. According to the chart, she'd been holding 3 doors down not 5 minutes earlier. Her professional mind lit up like a switchboard. Voluntary distal movement. Vocalization under emotional stimulus. Neither of those things happened in patients with the kind of complete, irreversible spinal damage his file claimed he had. She'd built a career on knowing the difference between what a body couldn't do and what a body had simply been told for years that it shouldn't try. Something didn't add up, and underneath the wonder rising in her chest, a colder question began to surface, quiet, but impossible to ignore once it arrived. If Yi-hoon's paralysis was real, permanent, the kind 7 years and every specialist in Lowe's angels couldn't touch, then why did a 5-year-old girl and 1 whispered word just prove otherwise in under 60 seconds? She didn't have an answer, not yet, but she filed the question away the way she filed away everything that scared her, carefully, silently, someplace she could return to later when she had the privacy to actually feel it. Behind her, the guards still hadn't moved, though the tension in the hallway had shifted into something Naomi could only describe as disbelief. One of them, young, barely out of his 20s, the kind of face that hadn't yet learned to hide what it was feeling, actually took a step backward, like the room itself had become something holy he wasn't sure he was allowed to witness. "He hasn't," the young guard started, then stopped, swallowing hard. 7 years, he hasn't said anything in 7 years. Naomi turned her head slightly, keeping Yi-hoon in her peripheral vision, unwilling to break whatever fragile thread was stretching between him and her daughter. Is that true? Nobody answered her directly, but she saw it confirmed in every face pressed into that doorway. The older guard near the window, whose jaw had gone slack. The one by the nightstand, quietly crossing himself. The kind of collective silence that only happens when grown men who have seen everything are suddenly seeing something they never expected to see again. Annabelle, blissfully unbothered by any of it, climbed half a step closer to the bed, unafraid in the specific, luminous way that only children who haven't yet been taught what fear is supposed to look like can manage. She held up her sneaker, angling it so the small LED lights embedded in the sole caught what little light slipped through the sealed curtains, blinking red and gold against the dim. "These light up when I run," she informed him solemnly, as if delivering vital intelligence. "I'm really fast, faster than my friend Caden, and he's 6. Yi-hoon's eyes stayed fixed on her. And then, slow, unpracticed, like a muscle relearning a motion it hadn't performed in years, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Not yet. But something adjacent to one, something that hadn't visited that face in longer than the little girl in front of him had been alive. "Ma'am, I really think," the young guard tried again, but Naomi cut him off with a look, not unkind, but final. She wasn't a mother in that moment who needed correcting. She was a clinician watching a case rewrite itself in real time, and every instinct she had told her that pulling Annabelle away right now, breaking whatever was happening, would be the actual mistake, not letting it continue. "Give them a second," she said quietly. "Please." The room held. Yi-hoon's fingers curled again against the sheet, more deliberate this time, and Naomi realized with a jolt that he wasn't just twitching anymore. He was trying to lift his hand. Trying and failing and trying again, jaw tightening with an effort that had nothing to do with his damaged spine and everything to do with will. 7 years of stillness cracking open in front of a child who had no idea she was witnessing a miracle, because to her it wasn't one. To her, it was just a man who needed reminding that racing was more fun than lying still. "You gonna race me or not?" Annabelle pressed, hands back on her hips, the universal posture of a 5-year-old who has decided the adult in front of her is stalling. And Yi-hoon, the snow wolf, the most feared boss in the Lee Syndicate, a man 3 separate physical therapists had walked away from and never returned to, a man whose own family had stopped visiting somewhere around year 3, looked at the little girl standing fearless at the foot of his bed, took in a breath that shook visibly through his chest, and whispered a second word. 2 syllables this time, rougher than the first, dragged up from somewhere even deeper. The name of the wheelchair folded and untouched in the corner of that room, gathering dust for 7 years like a promise nobody believed he'd ever keep. And every single guard in that hallway went pale, because in 7 years, nobody, not his brother, not his physicians, not the men paid to protect him, had ever heard Lee Yi-hoon ask for it. Naomi felt her pulse pounding in her ears, felt the weight of everything she still didn't understand pressing down on her chest. The unlabeled IV bags, the no chain, scrawled across 7 years of paperwork by men who clearly hadn't been trying. The question of who exactly wanted this man kept exactly the way he was and why. But underneath all of it, underneath every professional alarm bell going off in her head, was something simpler and harder to name. Her daughter had just done, in under a minute, what an entire mansion full of trained professionals had failed to do in 7 years. And somewhere behind her, she heard the click of a door at the far end of the hallway, soft, careful, deliberate, the sound of someone who had been watching this entire moment unfold, and had just quietly slipped away to make a phone call Naomi wasn't meant to hear. "Before we see where this goes, I need you to hear me on this. What's coming for Naomi and Annabelle in this story is the kind of injustice too many of our families know by heart, corrupt power reaching into a home and trying to tear a mother from her child. If you believe no parent should ever have to live in fear of that, hit subscribe right now. Let's make sure this story gets told the way it deserves." Naomi didn't turn around to see who'd made that call. She didn't need to. Some instinct older than her medical training, older than fear itself, told her that whatever had just happened in that room had been seen by someone who was not happy about it, and that the smart thing, the only thing, was to keep her face calm and her hands steady until she understood exactly what she was dealing with. She got her chance an hour later, alone, after the guards had cleared the room and Preston had ushered a still-buzzing Annabelle back to the hallway bench with a tablet and a promise of cartoons. Naomi asked, with all the professional detachment she could manufacture, for a full accounting of Yi-hoon's current medications. Preston hesitated, just half a second too long, before handing her a folder thinner than it had any right to be for 7 years of treatment. She read it standing in the hallway, back against cool marble, and felt something in her chest go cold and still. 3 IV lines. She'd clocked them earlier without understanding what she was looking at. One was standard hydration. The second was a mild sedative, low dose, unremarkable on its own. But the third was a nerve-blocking agent, the kind used short-term after acute spinal trauma to manage pain during the earliest, most fragile stages of recovery. 2 weeks, maybe 3, was the outer edge of how long a legitimate physician would ever leave a patient on something like that. The dosage log in front of her showed continuous administration, not for weeks, for years. Someone wasn't treating Lee Yi-hoon. Someone was keeping him chemically paralyzed and dressing it up as compassionate care for a man too broken to fight back. Naomi had spent 14 years learning how to read a body, what damage looked like, what recovery looked like, what a nervous system that had genuinely given up looked like versus one that had simply been told, chemically, relentlessly, that it wasn't allowed to try. Yi-hoon's fingers curling against that sheet, his jaw working to force out 2 words he hadn't spoken in 7 years. That wasn't a man with no feeling left in his body. That was a man fighting through a fog someone else had built around him, 1 milligram at a time. She thought about the phone call she'd heard clicking shut down the hallway. She thought about 3 previous physical therapists whose employment records, according to the folder Ruiz would later show her, simply stopped after this address. And for the first time since she'd signed that contract, Naomi understood she wasn't just underqualified for a difficult case. She was standing in the middle of something somebody wanted to stay buried. The smart move, the safe move, the move that protected Annabelle and the roof over both their heads, was to document what she'd found, quietly withdraw from the contract citing conflict with her clinical judgment, and drive far away from Bel Air and never look back. She actually stood there in that hallway rehearsing the words she'd say to Preston. "I don't believe I'm the right fit for this case." Then she heard the soft scrape of wheels against hardwood from inside the sealed room, and she knew she wasn't leaving. She found him upright, barely, unsteadily, one arm braced hard against the headboard, the other gripping the frame of the wheelchair he dragged an inch closer to the bed through what must have been agonizing effort. He was sweating, breathing hard through his nose like a man who'd just run a mile instead of moved a piece of furniture 18 inches. When he saw her in the doorway, he didn't look ashamed of the effort. He looked at her the way a drowning man looks at the one person on the shore who hasn't looked away yet. "You saw it," he said. His voice was still rough, still unpracticed, but steadier than it had been an hour ago, like speaking itself was a muscle already beginning to remember its old shape. "The chart." Naomi didn't pretend not to understand. "I saw a nerve-blocking agent that should have been discontinued years ago. I saw dosage logs that don't match any legitimate rehabilitation protocol I've ever reviewed." She kept her voice low, professional, even as her pulse hammered. "Mr. Lee, who ordered this medication?" He didn't answer that, not directly. Instead he said, with the flat, exhausted honesty of a man who'd stopped bothering to protect himself a long time ago, "If they know I can feel my legs, you will not make it to your car." The sentence landed in Naomi's chest like a stone dropped into still water. Not a threat from him, a warning. And underneath it, the quiet, terrible confirmation of everything she'd already started to suspect. Whoever was keeping this man sedated wasn't protecting him from further injury. They were protecting themselves from his recovery. "Then why," Naomi said carefully, "are you telling me?" For a long moment Yi-hoon said nothing, just studied her the way she imagined he'd once studied men across negotiating tables, sizing up whether a person could be trusted with something that could get them both killed. Then his eyes moved past her, toward the hallway, toward the sound of Annabelle's cartoon leaking faintly through the closed door. Some cheerful, tinny theme song completely at odds with everything happening in this room. "Because of her," he said simply. Naomi felt her throat tighten. She thought of every reason to say no. The contract, the NDA, the $250,000 still hanging over her family like a blade. The very real, very credible threat this man had just handed her wrapped in 7 words. She thought of her mother, still recovering 2 counties away, unaware her daughter was standing in a room deciding whether to risk everything for a stranger. And she thought of the sound Annabelle had made in that hallway, pure delighted laughter, easy as breathing. The first sound this house had probably heard in years that didn't come laced with fear. "If I do this," Naomi said slowly, each word deliberate, "it doesn't happen through official channels. No paperwork, no documented sessions, nothing that goes into a file someone else can read." She was already thinking like a woman building a case in her head, the same instinct that had got her through nursing rounds at 17 while her mother lay dying 2 floors up. You'd need to reduce the nerve blocker gradually, under close monitoring, without anyone adjusting your chart to notice the change. "That's dangerous, Mr. Lee. That's the kind of dangerous that could kill you if it's not managed exactly right." "I have been dying for 7 years, Yi-hoon said, and there was nothing dramatic in the way he said it, just a tired, factual weariness that Naomi recognized instantly, because she'd heard that same flatness in her own voice more times than she wanted to admit since the funeral. Slowly is not new. She should have walked away right then. Every rational part of her screamed it. Instead, she found herself crossing the room, checking his pulse the way habit demanded even in the middle of a decision that could end her career and possibly her life, and said the words before she'd fully decided to say them. "We do this quietly, we do this carefully, and the second it becomes unsafe for either of us, it stops." Something shifted in his face, not quite relief, not quite trust, but the first crack in 7 years of a man expecting nothing from anyone. The door creaked, and both of them turned sharply, Naomi's heart lurching into her throat, but it was only Annabelle. Tablet abandoned, standing in the doorway with her hands on her hips and an expression of profound, businesslike seriousness. "Are you guys planning the race?" she asked. "Because I should be the referee, I know all the rules." Naomi opened her mouth to send her back to the hallway, some reflexive parental instinct kicking in about a 5-year-old inserting herself into a conversation about medication protocols and hidden dangers. But Yi-hoon, for the first time since Naomi had walked into that mansion, made a sound that took her a full second to recognize. He laughed, rough, rusty, barely there, but unmistakably a laugh. "She is right," he said, looking at Naomi with something that hadn't been in his eyes an hour ago. "Every race needs a referee." And just like that, in a blackout bedroom in a house built to keep secrets, the deadliest man in the Lee syndicate found himself taking direction from a 5-year-old in yellow overalls, while 3 doors away, a phone that shouldn't have been listening had already relayed everything to a man who would not tolerate this house waking up. Naomi didn't know that phone call had already reached someone until she pulled out of the estate gates that evening and found a man leaning against a sedan parked just far enough down the road to look casual and close enough to make it clear he'd been waiting specifically for her. She almost didn't stop. Every instinct that had kept her and Annabelle safe for the past year told her to keep driving, lock the doors, get home. But the man lifted both hands, slow and deliberate, the universal gesture of someone who wanted to be trusted, and something about the tired set of his shoulders made her ease off the gas instead of pressing down on it. "Dr. Twinkers." He said her name like he already knew it well, like he'd said it to himself more than once while sitting in that car. "Detective Mateo Ruiz, LAPD organized crime, well," a humorless half-smile. "Used to be, I need 5 minutes." Naomi kept her window cracked only a few inches, her other hand resting near the gear shift, Annabelle asleep in the back seat with her cheek pressed against the window. "I have somewhere to be." "I know you do." Ruiz's eyes flicked briefly to the back seat, and something in his expression softened, just for a second before hardening again. "That's exactly why I'm here." He held up a flash drive between 2 fingers, the small plastic case catching the last orange light of the evening. You've been at that house one day. You've already noticed the medication logs don't match the file. I know you have, because I know exactly how good you are, Dr. Twinkers. Better than the 3 who came before you. Naomi's grip tightened on the wheel. 3. 3 physical therapists at that address before you. Board certified, all of them. All of them stopped taking new patients somewhere around the 6-month mark, according to their state licensing records. Ruiz let that sit for a moment, watching her face. None of them live in California anymore. The words landed with a weight that made her stomach turn. She thought of the thin folder, the no change scrawled in different handwriting across 7 years. Not one voice trying and failing. Multiple voices, silenced or scattered, one after another. I don't know what you're implying, Detective, but I have a contract. You have a death clause, Dr. Twinkers. I've seen it. I've seen 3 of them, actually, because I pulled the paperwork on the therapists before you. He took a step closer to the car, not aggressive, just urgent, like a man who'd rehearsed this moment and knew he only had one shot at it before she drove away and never answered his calls again. I'm not here to scare you. I'm here because I think you're in more danger right now than you understand, and I think somebody made sure of that on purpose. Naomi should have driven away. She thought about it, really thought about it, hand hovering near the gear shift, Annabelle's soft breathing behind her the only sound she cared about protecting. But something in the way Ruiz said on purpose cracked, something open in her chest that she'd been holding shut for over a year now, ever since a highway patrolman had knocked on her door at 11 at night with his hat in his hands. Say what you came to say, she said quietly. Ruiz exhaled, like he'd been holding that breath since he first spotted her car leaving the gate. Your husband's debts. The $250,000 currently sitting on your name like a boulder. I know you've spent the last year believing he made some catastrophic financial mistake he never told you about. Gambling, bad investments, something he was ashamed of. He held the drive out toward the window, close enough that she could see her own reflection warped across its glossy black case. He didn't. You don't know anything about my husband. I know the loans were issued through 3 shell companies, all of them tracing back through a laundering structure that's taken federal investigators the better part of 2 years to map. Ruiz's voice had gone low, careful, the tone of a man delivering news he knew would detonate something in the person hearing it. I know those shell companies are owned, several layers deep, by a holding group controlled by Lee Du-hyun. The name meant nothing to Naomi yet, not the way it would in 24 hours, not the way it eventually would mean everything. But the certainty in Ruiz's voice made the hair on her arms rise anyway. Who is that? Yi-hoon's half-brother. Ruiz watched her face carefully as he said it, like he was measuring exactly how much she already knew and how much was about to hit her for the first time. The man who's been running the Lee Syndicate's finances for the last 7 years. The man, Dr. Twinkers, who signs off on every single hearing decision at that estate, including yours. Naomi felt the ground tilt slightly beneath her, the particular vertigo of a truth rearranging itself in real time. You're telling me the man who destroyed my husband is the same man who hired me to treat his brother. I'm telling you your husband didn't gamble that money away. Ruiz's voice cracked slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of finally saying something he'd clearly wanted to say to someone for a long time and had never found the right moment. He was set up. Every single one of those transactions was engineered to look like reckless personal debt, so nobody would ever go looking for where the money actually went. And I think, though I can't prove it yet, that your husband found out. Right before the accident. The word accident hung differently in the air than it ever had in Naomi's own head. And for the first time in over a year, she let herself consider, fully and without flinching, that it might not have been one. She sat frozen for a long moment, hands still on the wheel, the flash drive still hovering between them like something radioactive neither of them wanted to be the first to touch. In the backseat, Annabelle stirred slightly, murmured something unintelligible, and settled again, and the sound of her daughter's small, trusting breath was the only thing keeping Naomi's hands from shaking. Why me? She finally asked, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. If he's the one who hired me, why would he bring in someone who might actually help his brother recover? That doesn't make sense unless... She stopped. She watched the answer arrive on Ruiz's face before he said it out loud, and some part of her had already known. Some part of her had known since she'd read that thin medical file with 7 years of no change written across it in a dozen different hands. Unless he expected you to fail exactly like the others, Ruiz said quietly. Unless every physical therapist before you was hired specifically to walk in, confirm the paralysis is permanent, sign off on it in writing, and disappear from the case before they ever had the chance to notice what you noticed today. Naomi's throat had gone dry. Notice what? That it isn't permanent. Ruiz leaned in slightly, his voice dropping almost to a whisper, as though even out here on an empty road he was afraid of being overheard. You're not his doctor, Dr. Twinkers. Not to the man who's paying your checks. You're his intended death certificate witness. A credentialed, respected professional whose name goes on the incompetency filing that lets Do-hyun consolidate full control of the syndicate without a single objection from the family elders. She sat with that for a moment, the enormity of it pressing down on her chest until she could barely draw breath. Every question she'd carried since her husband's funeral, the debts that made no sense, the friends who'd suddenly stopped returning her calls. The strange finality of a police report that closed the case in record time. All of it rearranging itself into a shape she hadn't let herself see until this exact moment. Parked on a dark road outside a mansion full of secrets, with her daughter asleep 12 inches behind her. The man paying my checks, she said slowly, testing the words like she was afraid they might shatter something if she said them too fast, is the same man who destroyed my life. Ruiz didn't answer. He didn't need to. He simply held the flash drive a little closer to the window, and this time, Naomi reached out and took it. Everything's on there, he said. Bank records, shell company filings, and something else you're going to want to see before you go back into that house tomorrow morning. His eyes flicked once more toward the mansion gate glowing faintly behind them in the dark, its wrought iron bars swallowing whatever light tried to escape it. A photograph, taken the night of the explosion that put Yi-hoon in that bed. I think you're going to recognize one of the men standing in the background. Naomi's hand tightened around the drive until the plastic edges bit into her palm. Who? Ruiz was already backing toward his car, glancing once more toward the estate as if he'd already stayed too long in the open. Look at it tonight, Dr. Twinkers, alone, and whatever you do, don't let anyone at that house know you have it. He was gone before she could ask another question, taillights disappearing around the bend, leaving Naomi alone in the dark with a flash drive burning a hole in her palm, her sleeping daughter breathing softly behind her, and the sick, dawning certainty that whatever waited on that drive was about to make it impossible for her to ever walk away from this house, even if walking away was the only thing standing between her family and whatever came next. Naomi didn't open the flash drive that night. She sat in her parked car outside her own apartment for 20 minutes with it resting in the cup holder like something that might go off, and then she carried it inside, locked it in the drawer where she kept her husband's old watch, and told herself she'd look at it when Annabelle was somewhere safer than the next room. Some truths, she'd learned since the funeral, needed a body strong enough to hold them before you let them in. She wasn't there yet. But she was close. What she did instead, over the following 2 weeks, was work. She built Yi-hoon's protocol the way she built every protocol that mattered, quietly, meticulously, with the kind of discipline that had gotten her through nursing school, while her mother slipped in and out of consciousness 2 floors above the library where she studied. Resistance bands smuggled in inside a diaper bag nobody thought to search twice. A pull-up bar disguised as a curtain rod, installed under the guise of improving natural light in a room that hadn't seen sunlight in 7 years. She weaned the nerve blocker down in careful, deliberate increments, documenting nothing on paper, adjusting the drip herself in the 2-minute windows. When the night nurse stepped out for her break, watching Yi-hoon's vitals like a woman watching a house she wasn't sure was built to hold the weight she was about to put on it. And every single day, Annabelle showed up to referee. You gotta count out loud, she informed Yi-hoon on the 4th day, perched cross-legged on a folded towel at the foot of his bed, a stopwatch borrowed from Naomi's phone clutched in both hands like it was the most important instrument in the mansion. That's the rule. If you don't count, it doesn't count. Yi-hoon, gripping the bar Naomi had bolted above his headboard, arms shaking with the effort of a pull he couldn't yet complete, managed to huff out something that might have been a laugh. "Who made this rule?" "Me, I'm the referee." Annabelle said this with the flat, unshakable authority of a 5-year-old who had never once doubted her own jurisdiction over anything. "6, she added, apropos of nothing, apparently counting something only she could see. Naomi watched from the doorway, arms crossed, professional detachment slowly losing ground to something warmer she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. In 14 years of practice, she had seen motivation come from 100 different places: pride, fear, spite, love. She had never once seen it come from a stopwatch and a 5-year-old's insistence on fair play. But something about the absolute, uncomplicated faith in Annabelle's voice reached a place in Yi-hoon that Naomi's clinical encouragement never could. And by the second week, the results were undeniable. His trunk control returned first, the ability to sit fully upright without bracing against the headboard, a milestone that in most spinal cases took months, sometimes never came at all. Then his shoulders, his arms, thickening back into the shape they'd clearly once held before 7 years of stillness had hollowed them out. By the 10th day, he completed his first full pull-up, and Annabelle screamed so loud in celebration that Naomi had to physically clap a hand over her daughter's mouth and beg her, laughing despite herself, to please remember they were supposed to be quiet. 7 years of rage were packed into every pull-up Yi-hoon completed after that, each one faster, harder, angrier than the last, like his body had been storing up every year of stolen movement and was determined to spend it all at once. Naomi had to physically stop him some evenings, hands on his shoulders, voice firm. "That's enough. Your muscles need recovery time. This isn't about how fast, it's about how sustainable." And he would look at her with an expression she recognized instantly, because she'd worn it herself in the year after her husband's funeral. The look of someone who has spent so long being told to sit still that movement itself feels like the only proof they're still alive. It was on the 12th night, close to 11, well past when Naomi should have already had Annabelle home and in bed, that the door to Yi-hoon's room opened without a knock. Naomi's whole body went cold before she even turned around, already calculating how to explain the resistance band looped around his forearm, the sweat on his brow, the fact that the man in the bed wasn't lying flat at all but sitting fully upright, unassisted, gripping the headboard bar with both hands. Kwan filled the doorway, broad-shouldered, silent, the kind of stillness that came from years of standing exactly where he was told to stand and seeing exactly what he was told to see and nothing else. His hand was already on his weapon, the holster snap undone, the particular readiness of a man whose entire job depended on reacting before thinking. Kwan stood in the doorway with his gun drawn, staring at his boss sitting upright, and for 3 full seconds, nobody in that room breathed. Naomi stepped instinctively between him and the bed, some fierce maternal instinct overriding every professional boundary she'd ever respected, though she knew with sick clarity that her body would do nothing to stop a bullet if that's what this moment became. Annabelle, oblivious, still perched on her towel with the stopwatch, looked up at the new arrival with mild curiosity, the way she looked at anything new that entered her orbit. "Are you the next racer?" she asked. Kwan didn't answer her. His eyes were locked on Yi-hoon, on the sight he must have believed impossible after 7 years of walking past that closed door every single night of his life. Naomi watched something move behind his expression, shock first, unmistakable, followed by something else, something she couldn't immediately name, something that looked almost like grief. "Kwan," Yi-hoon's voice was steadier now than it had been that first day, though it still carried the rasp of a man rebuilding something from ash. "Close the door." For a long, terrible moment, Naomi genuinely did not know which way this would break. Kwan's hand was still on his weapon. His loyalty, as far as she understood it, belonged to whoever currently signed his checks, and she had no idea whether that was Yi-hoon or the half-brother she'd learned the name of only 2 weeks earlier, sitting in her car outside these very gates. Then Kwan reholstered his gun, stepped inside, and did exactly what he was told. He closed the door behind him. And then, Instead of raising the alarm, instead of reaching for the radio clip to his shoulder, he simply turned, planted himself against the frame on the inside of the room, and stood guard facing the hallway instead of the bed. "Nobody comes through this door," he said quietly, not looking at either of them, "unless I say so." Naomi felt her knees nearly give out with relief, though she kept her face composed, the same discipline that had gotten her through every crisis of the last year holding her upright now. She didn't fully understand what she'd just witnessed, a bodyguard choosing silence over duty, protection over reporting, but she recognized the shape of it. Whatever loyalty Kwan carried, it wasn't as simple as the syndicate believed. The reprieve lasted exactly 4 days. It ended with a folder Preston delivered to Naomi's hands personally, his face arranged into the particular blankness of a man who knew exactly what he was carrying and had decided not to think too hard about it. Inside was a memo, dated, stamped, entirely official, an emergency medical audit, scheduled for the following week, ordered directly by Lee Do-hyun's office, requiring full independent evaluation of Yi-hoon's condition by a panel of 3 outside physicians. Naomi read it twice, standing in the hallway with her hands going cold around the paper, understanding immediately and completely what she was looking at. This wasn't a checkup. This was a formality dressed up as medicine, a document designed to arrive at exactly one conclusion, delivered by physicians who would never have been hired if there was any risk they'd find what she had already found. The audit wasn't a medical checkup. It was an execution order for his legal rights, a permanent incompetency ruling that would strip Yi-hoon of any legal standing within the syndicate forever, and hand full, uncontested control to the very man who had kept him drugged and silent for 7 years. She had 6 days to get a man who had been unable to sit upright 3 weeks ago strong enough to hide, indefinitely, from 3 physicians paid specifically not to notice him getting stronger. Before I tell you what happens in that audit, because trust me, what Do-hyun has planned is going to make your blood boil, I have to say something. If this story is reaching something in you, if you know what it feels like to fight quietly for someone the world already gave up on, then I want to put a book in your hands that's going to feel like coming home. It's called Stories That Make You Feel Something, 2 full novels, one that will break your heart and one that will heal it completely, love and loss and second chances woven through every page. It comes with a free audiobook, future books already included, and it's ready for you to download right now. The link is waiting in the description and pinned in the comments below. Go get it. You deserve a story that holds you the way you're about to hold this one. 6 days felt like nothing until Naomi actually tried to fill them, and by the 4th, she had built a plan so precise it ran on minutes. A rotating schedule of covert sessions, a system of hand signals with Kwan for when the hallway was clear, a way of packing Yi-hoon's medical supplies into ordinary shopping bags so nothing on the estate's inventory logs would ever hint at what was actually happening behind that sealed door. She had not slept more than 4 hours a night in a week. She had not, until that Thursday evening, let herself imagine that the danger might come for her outside these gates instead of inside them. She was standing in her own kitchen at 6:00 p.m., stirring dinner on the stove, half listening to Annabelle narrate an elaborate imaginary race between her toy car and a spoon, when the knock came. 2 uniformed police officers. A woman in a gray blazer holding a clipboard and a badge that read Lowe's Angels County Department of Children and Family Services. And behind them, unmistakably, the calm, unbothered posture of people who already knew exactly how this was going to end before they'd even rung the bell. Dr. Naomi Twinkers. The woman's voice was clinical, rehearsed, the voice of someone reading from a script she'd delivered 100 times before and felt nothing about anymore. We've received a report alleging unsafe conditions and neglect concerning a minor in this household. We're going to need to speak with you, and we'll need to take custody of the child pending investigation. Naomi felt the floor tilt beneath her. That's not, there's been some mistake. I don't understand. We don't have any. Ma'am, I need you to step back. One of the officers moved forward, and Naomi realized with sick, dawning clarity that this wasn't a conversation. This was already a decision that had been made somewhere else, by someone else, hours or days before this doorbell ever rang. They took Annabelle at 6:00 p.m., using false police reports as their weapon. A fabricated complaint alleging conditions Naomi would later learn had been invented wholesale, filed by a name that traced back through 3 shell identities to an address that didn't exist. But in that moment, standing in her own kitchen with a wooden spoon still dripping sauce onto her floor, Naomi didn't know any of that. She only knew that a stranger in a gray blazer was crouching down in front of her daughter, saying something soft and practiced about a fun little sleepover, while Annabelle's face slowly crumpled from confusion into fear. "Mommy," Annabelle's voice cracked on the word, small and rising, the particular pitch of a child who has never once in her life doubted that her mother could fix anything. "Mommy, I don't want to go." "Baby, it's okay." Naomi's own voice broke as she said it, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth even as she forced it out, because the alternative, telling her daughter the truth, that she didn't know if it was okay, that she had no power in this moment to stop any of it, was unthinkable. "It's okay. I'm going to fix this, I promise you. I'm going to fix this so fast." "Ma'am, please step back." The officer's hand found her shoulder, not rough, but immovable, the particular gentleness of institutional power that doesn't need to raise its voice because it already has every advantage. Naomi lunged forward anyway, every instinct in her body screaming to put herself between her daughter and the door, and it took both officers to hold her back while the woman with the clipboard lifted Annabelle, still reaching, still crying, still calling mommy, mommy, mommy in a voice that would live in Naomi's chest like a wound for the rest of her life, and carried her out into a car idling at the curb. The door closed, the car pulled away, and Naomi stood in her own doorway, in the wreckage of a kitchen that still smelled like dinner she'd never finished cooking, screaming her daughter's name into a street that had already gone quiet. She didn't remember driving to the estate. She remembered arriving, gates, guards, Preston's face going pale at whatever expression she was wearing, and she remembered nothing stopping her from walking straight past all of them, through hallways she'd once been terrified to enter without an escort, until she reached Yi-hoon's door and threw it open without knocking for the first time in 5 weeks. He was upright, fully, unassisted, sitting on the edge of the bed with his feet planted on the floor in a way that would have seemed impossible a month ago. And whatever he saw on her face made him go still in a way Naomi hadn't seen since the day she'd walked in on him barely able to lift a finger. "They took her," Naomi said, and her voice came out in pieces, shattered around the words. "They took Annabelle. Fabricated report, fake complaint. I don't know how to get her back. I don't know who to call, I don't." She stopped. She was crying now, fully, the kind of crying she hadn't allowed herself since the night the highway patrolman knocked on her door with his hat in his hands, and some distant, clinical part of her mind noted with surprise that she wasn't ashamed of it. Not here, not in front of him. Yi-hoon didn't say anything for a long moment. And then, in one motion that made Naomi's breath catch in her throat, he gripped the edge of the bed frame and pushed himself upright onto his own 2 feet. He swayed, his knees nearly buckled. Kwan, who had followed Naomi into the room, lunged forward instinctively to steady him, but Yi-hoon waved him off with a sharp gesture, planting one hand against the wall, forcing his legs that hadn't held his full weight in 7 years, to hold him upright through sheer, furious will. "Who did this?" he said. His voice had dropped into something Naomi hadn't heard from him before, low and utterly controlled, the voice, she understood suddenly, of the man he'd been before that mansion had swallowed him alive. "I don't know yet. I only know it wasn't a real complaint. None of it was real." "It was Do Hyun." Yi-hoon said the name like a verdict already delivered. "He knows. Somehow he knows what we have been doing, and he could not stop me directly, so he went for the only thing that would break you." For 7 years he stayed in bed. But for Annabelle, he stood up, fully, unaided, one trembling step forward and then another, crossing the room toward Naomi on legs that shouldn't have been able to carry him yet. Closing the distance between them until he stood directly in front of her, steady now, or steady enough, his dark eyes burning with something Naomi had never seen in them before. "I swear to you," he said. "On whatever is left of my life, on whatever honor this family has not already burned to the ground, I will get your daughter back." Naomi searched his face for any hint of empty promise, any trace of the performative reassurance she'd grown so tired of hearing from institutions that had failed her 100 small ways over the past year. She found none. What she found instead was the same fury she felt burning behind her own ribs, mirrored back at her in a man who had spent 7 years being told he could do nothing, and had apparently decided, in this exact moment, that those days were finished. "You picked the wrong mother to mess with," Naomi said, and her voice had stopped shaking, had hardened into something cold and clear, "and the wrong man to cross." Behind her, still holding position at the door, Kwan's hand had already moved back to his weapon, not in caution this time, but readiness. And somewhere across the city, in an office Naomi had never seen and a name she barely knew, Lee Do-hyun believed he had just broken the last piece of resistance standing between him and total control of everything his family had ever built. He had no idea what he'd actually done. Do-hyun thought taking the girl would make Naomi break. It only made her dangerous, and standing beside her, on legs that shouldn't yet be able to hold him, was a man the entire syndicate had written off as already dead, now very much awake, and very much done staying quiet. If you agree that Yi-hoon and Naomi just became the ultimate team, the kind no man like Do-hyun should ever underestimate, leave alike right now. Let's show him exactly what he's up against. Ruiz called at 2 a.m., and Naomi picked up before the first ring finished, because she hadn't actually slept. She'd been sitting upright in her own living room with the flash drive open on her laptop for the 3rd time that night, staring at grainy shell company filings until the letters stopped making sense, waiting for a phone to ring that would tell her something, anything, about where they'd taken her daughter. "I have a federal warrant," Ruiz said, no greeting, straight into it, the particular urgency of a man who'd been chasing something for 2 years and could finally feel it moving. "Judge signed off an hour ago. We've had eyes on Do-hyun's private line since your husband's case first crossed my desk, but I never had enough for a full wire until tonight, until the placement report on your daughter hit the system with his fingerprints all over the paper trail." A pause, heavy with something that sounded almost like an apology. "Dr. Twinkers, I think we're about to get everything." Naomi was in her car within 4 minutes, driving through empty streets toward an address Ruiz gave her in clipped, careful sentences. A surveillance van parked 2 blocks from a downtown office tower, the kind of unremarkable gray vehicle nobody looks at twice. Yi-hoon was already there when she arrived, which shouldn't have been possible. A man who 3 weeks ago couldn't sit upright now standing at the van's rear doors on legs, still visibly unsteady. Kwan hovering close enough to catch him if he swayed, but not so close as to make it look like help was needed. Naomi didn't ask how he'd gotten there without the estate noticing. She understood, by now, that a man fighting for his daughter figure's safety would find a way around locked gates that 7 years of imprisonment had never managed to hold him behind. "You should not be standing," she said anyway, because some habits didn't switch off even in the middle of chaos. "You should not be here without her," Yi-hoon answered, and the words landed exactly as hard as he meant them to. Inside the van, a young federal tech with headphones around his neck nodded them toward a bank of monitors, adjusting dials with the quiet concentration of someone who understood the weight of what was about to play. Ruiz stood behind him, arms crossed, jaw tight. "We caught something 40 minutes ago," Ruiz said. "Do-hyun, on a call to someone inside the placement agency. I want you both to hear it exactly as it happened." The recording crackled to life. Do-hyun's voice, when it came through the speakers, carried none of the polished, corporate calm Naomi had imagined from everything Ruiz had told her about him. It was tight, irritated, the voice of a man managing an inconvenience rather than committing a crime, which somehow made it worse. "The girl needs to stay in the system through Friday. That's all I need. Once the audit clears the incompetency ruling, this becomes irrelevant, and you can return her to whatever foster placement paperwork makes this disappear cleanly." Naomi's hands curled into fists at her sides. Hearing her daughter reduced to a scheduling inconvenience in a stranger's mouth did something to her that she'd need days to fully process. But in that van, in that moment, all she let herself feel was the cold, focused clarity of a woman building a case. The recording continued, the agency contact's voice barely audible, deferential, before Do-hyun cut back in, impatient. "I don't care what it costs. I've spent 7 years managing my brother's condition. I am not losing control of this family over a physical therapist and her kid." Managing my brother's condition. Naomi felt Yi-hoon go rigid beside her, and she understood, watching his jaw tighten, that whatever came next in this recording was about to answer a question that had been sitting unspoken between them since the day she'd first read his dosage logs and understood someone was keeping him sedated on purpose. She'd never asked him directly who she suspected had ordered it. Some truths, she realized now, he'd been protecting her from having to say out loud. The agency contact's voice returned, faint, asking something about liability, about how long they could reasonably justify the placement without documentation. And Do-hyun's answer, when it came, was delivered with the flat, chilling efficiency of a man who had made peace with what he'd done a long time ago. He was never supposed to survive that explosion. I miscalculated the dosage the first responders would give him at the scene, and by the time I realized he'd live, the story was already out. Hero, boss, targeted hit, sympathetic injury. Revering that narrative would have raised questions I couldn't afford. So I kept him alive, kept him quiet, and kept every doctor who came near him convinced there was nothing left to fix. The van went completely silent except for the low hum of recording equipment. Naomi turned, slowly, to look at Yi-hoon, and what she saw on his face wasn't shock. It was confirmation, the specific, devastating stillness of a man hearing a truth he had already suspected in his bones, but had never let himself fully believe, because believing it meant accepting that his own blood had chosen a corporate chair and an offshore account over him. "He sold out his own blood," Yi-hoon said quietly, almost to himself, "for a title and a bank account." The digital recorder caught every single word of the murder confession, unbroken, unambiguous, time-stamped and clean. The kind of evidence Naomi understood, even without Ruiz's confirming nod, that could not be explained away by any lawyer Do-hyun's money could buy. Naomi held the audio file that could bring down an entire syndicate, and for one long, unsteady moment, the sheer scale of what they now held in their hands made her knees go weak. "This is enough," Ruiz said, quiet but certain, watching the waveform on his screen like it was something sacred. "This is more than enough. Federal prosecutors will move on this within days, but Dr. Twinkers—" He turned to face her fully now, his expression sobering. "This also means Do-hyun knows we're close. A man who confesses to attempted murder on a private line is a man who believes that line is secure. The second he suspects otherwise, he stops managing this quietly and starts managing it violently. We need to move faster than he expects." Naomi nodded, already thinking 3 steps ahead, already cataloging every version of danger this new evidence might invite. But it was Yi-hoon who spoke next, his voice steady in a way that made both Ruiz and Naomi turn to look at him. "There is something else you will need," he said. "Money, lawyers, whatever resources it takes to fight a custody battle against corrupt officials, and whatever it costs to protect Annabelle once she is returned to you." He reached into the jacket Kwan had draped over his shoulders, producing a phone Naomi hadn't seen before, his fingers moving with slow, deliberate care across the screen, a man relearning fine motor precision in real time, under pressure. Refusing to let his hands fail him now of all moments. "I am transferring the entirety of my personal accounts into a defense fund under your name, effective tonight." "Yi-hoon, I can't." "You are not asking," he said, and something in his voice carried the unmistakable authority of a man who had once commanded rooms full of powerful men without raising his voice, a shadow of the boss he'd been before 7 years of stolen silence. "I am telling you, whatever Do-hyun has spent 7 years trying to take from me, I am spending tonight to make sure he does not take anything else from you." Naomi felt something crack open in her chest, not grief this time, not fear, but the specific, disorienting warmth of realizing that somewhere in the last 5 weeks, in blackout bedrooms and stolen physical therapy sessions and a stopwatch held by small, determined hands, she had stopped fighting this battle alone. She looked at Ruiz, steady behind his monitors. At Kwan, still guarding the door even here, loyalty finally landed on the right side of this fight. At Yi-hoon, upright on legs that shouldn't yet hold him, transferring everything he owned into her name without a moment's hesitation. "We get her back," Naomi said, and it wasn't a question anymore. It was a plan already in motion. "Tomorrow, however we have to do it." Ruiz was already reaching for his own phone, dialing a number with the urgency of a man who understood exactly how quickly this window could close. "Tomorrow," he agreed. "But Dr. Twinkers, I need you to understand something before we go any further." His expression had shifted, gone careful in a way that made Naomi's stomach tighten before he'd even said the words. "That placement report I mentioned, the one with Do-hyun's fingerprints all over it." He hesitated, glancing once toward Yi-hoon before looking back at her. "It wasn't filed under a false identity like the initial complaint. This one has a name attached to it. Someone inside your daughter's own extended family tree signed off on the transfer paperwork tonight. Someone Do-hyun didn't have to fabricate at all, because apparently he'd already found them." Naomi's breath caught in her throat. "What name?" she whispered. If you were cheering the second Yi-hoon rolled, walked, fought, whatever it took, into that room to stand beside Naomi, drop your city in the comments below. Let's see how far this story has traveled tonight. The name Ruiz gave her was her late husband's younger sister, a woman Naomi hadn't spoken to in over a year, not since a falling out at the funeral over money that made a sick kind of sense now, in hindsight, if that money had been Do-hyun's all along. Naomi didn't have time to sit with the betrayal, not that night. She filed it away the way she'd learned to file away every wound this last year had handed her. Carefully, silently, someplace she could return to once her daughter was safe. Because Ruiz was already explaining that a signature obtained through bribery could be challenged in family court within 48 hours, and 48 hours, right now, felt like the difference between everything and nothing. Annabelle came home on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after the wiretap, delivered back into Naomi's arms by a caseworker who wouldn't meet her eyes, and a judge's emergency order that Ruiz had walked through the courthouse himself to make sure nobody buried in paperwork. Naomi held her daughter in the parking lot of that county building and cried the kind of tears she hadn't let herself cry since the highway patrolman's visit, and Annabelle, small and warm and finally back where she belonged, patted her mother's back with the solemn seriousness of a 5-year-old comforting a grown-up for once, and said, "It's okay, Mommy. I told them you were coming." It was Yi-hoon's idea to bring her back to the estate that Friday. Naomi had hesitated, every protective instinct in her body recoiling at the thought of walking her daughter back through those gates after everything that had happened, but Yi-hoon had insisted, quietly, with a certainty that left no room for argument. She started this, he'd said. She should see how it is going. And so on Friday afternoon, with sunlight actually pouring through the estate's grand front windows for the first time in longer than Naomi had known this house, she walked her daughter back up the marble front steps, Annabelle's hand tight in hers, both of them a little braver than they'd been the last time. What Naomi didn't know, what nobody on that estate knew, save for Kwan and a single discreet medical supply courier who delivered a crate to the service entrance under an assumed name, was that Yi-hoon had spent the last 4 days preparing something. The wheelchair had arrived 2 days earlier. Custom-built, lightweight titanium frame, high-performance racing wheels canted at an angle designed for speed rather than convenience. The kind of chair built for athletes competing in marathons rather than a man the syndicate still believed couldn't lift a spoon. Yi-hoon had trained on it in secret. In the dead hours after midnight, Kwan standing guard at the door while he learned the particular physics of propelling himself at full speed down a hallway he'd once believed he'd never see in daylight again. He'd been waiting for exactly this moment, waiting for her. Naomi and Annabelle were halfway down the front hallway, sunlight streaming gold and warm across the marble floor, when a sound reached them that neither of them expected, the low, rhythmic whir of wheels moving fast, gaining speed, closing distance. The mansion fell completely silent as the wheelchair rolled out of the dark. Every guard posted along that hallway turned at once, and Naomi watched 7 years of disbelief ripple across faces that had spent nearly a decade certain of exactly one thing, that the man in that bedroom would never leave it again. Because there, framed in the doorway of the room that had swallowed him whole for 7 years, sat Yi-hoon, no longer hidden behind blackout curtains, no longer folded into shadow, propelling himself forward into full daylight with both arms driving hard against the wheels, moving with a speed and confidence that made it clear, immediately, unmistakably. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was warming up. Annabelle spotted him first. Her whole face lit up, lead sneakers already scuffing against the marble as she broke into a sprint without a second's hesitation, yellow overalls flashing bright against the dark wood-paneled walls, pigtails bouncing wild behind her. "You got a fast chair," she shrieked, delighted, already running to meet him. "That's not fair, that's cheating." "No such thing as cheating," Yi-hoon called back, and there was something in his voice Naomi had never heard from him before, pure, unguarded joy. The sound of a man who had spent 7 years forgetting what his own laughter sounded like and was only now remembering. Only winning and losing. And then they were racing. Naomi stood frozen at the edge of that grand hallway, one hand pressed flat against her chest, watching a scene so absurd and so beautiful that she couldn't have written it herself if she'd tried. A legendary crime boss, dragons and tigers climbing his forearms, wheeling at full speed down a marble corridor beside a shrieking, giggling 5-year-old in yellow overalls, both of them laughing so hard neither one could have said, if asked, who was actually winning. The look on the guards' faces was worth every second of secret training Naomi had poured into this moment. Men who had spent 7 years standing silent sentry over a tomb now watching, open-mouthed, as the man they guarded came roaring back to life in front of them. Kwan stepped out from the doorway where he'd been standing watch, and for the first time since Naomi had met him, his face wasn't unreadable. He was smiling, actually smiling, wide and unguarded, as he watched his boss race a child down a hallway that had been silent for longer than most of the staff had worked there. Annabelle reached the far window first, slapping her palm flat against the glass with a triumphant scream of victory, and Yi-hoon rolled up half a second behind her, breathing hard, grinning in a way that had transformed his entire face into something Naomi had genuinely never seen. Not the hollow-eyed man in the dark room, not the guarded, calculating survivor rebuilding himself in secret, but something closer to the man he must have been before 7 years of stolen silence had buried him alive. "I won," Annabelle announced, hands on her hips, utterly unaware, gloriously, beautifully unaware, that she wasn't just racing a man in a wheelchair down a hallway. She was riding beside a king, finally returning to a throne everyone believed he'd never reclaim. "You won," Yi-hoon agreed, still catching his breath, and then, with a flourish that made Naomi's heart squeeze tight in her chest, he reached up and pulled off the small pink plastic crown Annabelle had apparently crowned him with at some point during the last 30 seconds. Naomi hadn't even seen her produce it. Some toy pulled from an overall pocket that seemed to hold an endless supply of treasures, and placed it gently, deliberately, back onto his own head, wearing it with the solemn dignity of a man accepting an honor he'd genuinely earned. The guards along that hallway didn't move, didn't speak. Some of them, Naomi noticed, had actual tears standing in their eyes, 7 years of quiet grief cracking open all at once at the sight of their boss laughing, breathing hard, alive in a way none of them had let themselves hope for anymore. Kwan crossed the hallway slowly, deliberately, and came to stand directly in front of Yi-hoon's chair. He didn't say anything at first. He simply reached down, took Yi-hoon's hand in both of his own, and bowed his head, not the perfunctory bow of hired protection, but something older, something that belonged to men who had once sworn oaths that meant something before an entire family had been poisoned by greed. "I should have protected you 7 years ago," Kwan said quietly. "I am not making that mistake again. Whatever comes next, I am with you, fully, whatever it costs." Yi-hoon gripped his hand back, hard, the two men understanding each other in a way that needed no further explanation. Naomi watched all of it, her daughter's joy, Yi-hoon's triumph, Kwan's quiet, fierce loyalty finally landing exactly where it belonged, and let herself feel, for one unguarded moment, something close to hope. They had the recording. They had Ruiz. They had a defense fund and a growing wall of allies inside a house that had once been built entirely to keep secrets. It was Preston, standing rigid near the front entrance with his phone pressed hard against his ear, who broke the moment. Naomi caught the exact second his face went pale, watched him turn away sharply, as if trying to hide his expression from the hallway full of witnesses, his voice dropping to a tense, clipped whisper that carried just far enough for her to catch 4 words before he disappeared around the corner. He knows he's coming. He wasn't coming for the hallway. He was coming for the summit, and Naomi understood. The second Kwan confirmed what Preston had overheard, that Do Hyun had moved up his timeline the instant word of Yi-hoon's wheelchair reached him, calling an emergency gathering of the syndicate's 5 elders that very evening, determined to force through the incompetency ruling and seize full control before his brother could recover enough to stop him in front of witnesses who mattered. "Tonight," Kwan said, still gripping the phone he'd taken from Preston, his voice tight with urgency. "Beverly Hills Estate, all 5 elders. He's telling them it's a formality, final confirmation before he assumes full authority." Yi-hoon's jaw tightened, but there was no fear in his face, only the cold, focused calm of a man who had spent 7 years being underestimated and had finally run out of patience for it. "Then we do not wait for him to finish that sentence." Naomi's mind was already racing 3 steps ahead, the same instinct that had carried her through every crisis since the night a highway patrolman knocked on her door. "Ruiz. We need Ruiz and that recording, and we need them there before Do Hyun gets through whatever speech he's prepared." She looked at Yi-hoon, at the chair he sat in, at the sheer impossibility of what she was about to suggest. "Can you do this, tonight?" "I have been waiting 7 years to do this," Yi-hoon said. "Tonight is not a problem." Ruiz met them 2 blocks from the estate an hour later, federal credentials in hand, 2 agents in an unmarked car trailing at a careful distance behind them, close enough to move fast if things went wrong, far enough to avoid tipping off security before the moment mattered most. Kwan drove. Naomi sat in the back beside Yi-hoon, the audio file loaded and ready on a laptop balanced across her knees, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. "You do not have to come inside," Yi-hoon said quietly, watching her in the dim light of the car. "This is dangerous, and you have already given enough for this fight." Naomi looked at him steadily. "You didn't leave my daughter to face this alone. I'm not leaving you to face this alone either." The Beverly Hills estate was lit up like a fortress when they arrived, valets and armed security stationed at every entrance, the unmistakable weight of old money and older violence hanging over the manicured hedges. Kwan bypassed the front entirely, guiding them instead toward a service corridor he clearly knew by memory, badge and old loyalties still carrying enough weight to get them past the first 2 checkpoints before anyone thought to question why the estranged half-brother's former bodyguard was walking through with strangers in tow. They reached the grand hall just as Do Hyun's voice carried through the closed double doors ahead. Smooth, confident, mid-sentence, the practiced cadence of a man who had rehearsed this speech many times in front of a mirror. "And given the medical panel's unanimous findings, I believe it is time this family accepted that my brother's condition is, and has always been, permanent. What I am proposing tonight is not a seizure of power. It is simply—" The doors burst open, and the boss they thought was bedridden rolled into the center of the room. The effect was instantaneous and total. 5 elderly men seated around a long mahogany table went rigid in their chairs, several rising halfway out of their seats, eyes wide with the particular disbelief of men witnessing something they had long ago accepted as impossible. Do Hyun, mid-gesture at the head of the table, froze completely, his composed corporate smile collapsing into something raw and unguarded for just a fraction of a second before he forced it back into place. "Yi-hoon." Do Hyun's voice came out steadier than his face suggested, though Naomi caught the tremor underneath it, the sound of a man scrambling to rewrite a script that had just been torn out of his hands. "This is me brother. You should be resting. This excitement is not good for your condition." "My condition," Yi-hoon said, wheeling himself fully into the room, chair humming smooth and confident across the polished floor. "Has improved considerably since you last checked on me, which, if my memory serves, was never." A ripple moved through the elders at the table, low murmurs. Sharp glances exchanged between men who had clearly been fed one narrative for 7 years and were now watching it unravel in real time. One of them, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, leaned forward slightly. "Du Hyun told us you have not spoken a coherent sentence since the attack." "Du Hyun," Yi-hoon said, "has told this family a great many things that were not true." He turned his chair slightly, glancing back toward the doorway, where Naomi stood beside Ruiz, laptop already open, cable connected to the estate's sound system through a port Kwan had located weeks earlier during a maintenance visit he'd never mentioned to anyone. "Which is why I brought proof." Du Hyun's composure cracked fully now, his eyes darting toward Naomi with something sharp and dangerous flashing behind them. "Whoever you are, you have no authority to be in this room." Detective Mateo Ruiz, LAPD Organized Crime, working in coordination with the FBI. Ruiz stepped forward, badge raised, voice carrying easily across the silent room. "And I have a federal warrant that gives me exactly the authority I need." Naomi didn't wait for permission. She hit play. The recording filled the room, Du Hyun's own voice, cold, impatient, unmistakable, cutting through the tense silence with words that could not be walked back, could not be explained away, could not be reframed into anything other than what they were. He was never supposed to survive that explosion. I kept him alive, kept him quiet, and kept every doctor who came near him convinced there was nothing left to fix. 5 mob bosses listened in total silence to the tape of a brother's betrayal, and the silence that followed was worse than any shouting could have been, heavy, absolute, the sound of decades of loyalty curdling in real time. The silver-haired elder who had spoken earlier sat back slowly in his chair, his face gone hard and unreadable, the particular stillness of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about power in this family. "That is fabricated," Du Hyun said, but his voice had lost its polish entirely now, cracking around the edges. "Manipulated audio, doctored, you cannot possibly believe." "It is not fabricated," Kwan said, stepping fully into the room for the first time. His voice carrying the particular weight of a man who had spent 7 years in silent service and was done being silent. "I have listened to that voice give orders for a decade. That is your voice, and every man in this room knows it." Du Hyun's eyes swept the table, searching for allies, and found none. The elders who had smiled and nodded through his speech minutes earlier now stared back at him with expressions ranging from cold calculation to open disgust. Men who had built empires on loyalty now watching that loyalty evaporate in real time. "Guards," Du Hyun said sharply, turning toward the men stationed along the walls, his voice climbing with the first note of real panic Naomi had heard from him. "Remove them, all of them now." Nobody moved. Du Hyun turned, and Naomi watched the exact moment he understood the true depth of what had just happened. Every guard along that wall, men who had answered to him for years, standing utterly still, watching him with the same cold recalculation as the elders at the table. Kwan's arrival, Naomi realized, hadn't just been symbolic. He'd spent the drive over quietly reaching out to security contacts. He'd built relationships with over years of service. Men who had never fully trusted Du Hyun and needed only proof and permission to stop pretending otherwise. Du Hyun's hand moved, fast, toward the inside of his jacket, and the room erupted into motion, federal agents flooding through the door behind Ruiz, red laser sights blooming across Du Hyun's chest from a dozen directions at once before his hand had even cleared the fabric. Du Hyun reached for his weapon, but 20 lasers instantly painted his chest, and every drop of color drained from his face as he froze completely, hand still half buried in his jacket, understanding with sudden, total clarity that there was no version of tonight that ended with him walking out of this room in control of anything at all. "Du Hyun," Ruiz's voice was calm, almost gentle, the voice of a man who had waited 2 years for exactly this moment and had no intention of rushing it. "Hands where I can see them. You're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy, and racketeering, and that's just tonight's charges. We'll be adding to the list. Do-hyun's hand slowly emerged from his jacket, empty, trembling now with a fury he could no longer disguise as composure. His eyes found Yi-hoon across the room, and for one raw, unguarded moment, 7 years of buried resentment spilled out unchecked. I built everything this family has left, Do-hyun spat. While you rotted in that bed, I kept us alive. I modernized what you would have run into the ground with your outdated. You tried to kill your own brother, the silver-haired elder cut in sharply, rising fully to his feet now, voice ringing with the particular authority of a man who had just watched his entire understanding of loyalty rewritten in front of him. Whatever justification you have prepared, save it for whoever will still listen once this family finishes deciding what happens to you. Federal agents moved in, cuffs closing around Do-hyun's wrists as he was led from the room still protesting, still insisting he'd only ever tried to save what was left of an empire everyone else was too sentimental to protect. Naomi watched him go, watched the door close behind him, and felt something in her chest finally unclench after weeks of holding her breath. But as the room began to settle, as the elders turned toward Yi-hoon with expressions shifting slowly from shock into something like reverent apology, Naomi noticed Ruiz's phone buzzing insistently in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, and whatever he read there made his expression go tight and grave in a way that immediately pulled Naomi's attention away from the relief still flooding through the room. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Ruiz looked up at her, and for the first time all night, his composure cracked. The agents who took Do-hyun into custody, they just did a full sweep of his private office here at the estate. He hesitated, glancing once toward Yi-hoon before looking back at Naomi. "Dr. Twinkers, there's something in that office with your husband's name on it, something dated only 3 days before his accident. If tonight's takedown had your heart racing, if you felt that satisfaction the second those doors burst open, make sure you never miss what happens next. Subscribe now, because this story is not finished handing out justice yet." The document, Ruiz explained once they were back at the mansion, and Naomi could finally sit down and let her hands stop shaking, wasn't evidence of wrongdoing at all. It was the opposite. 3 days before his accident, Naomi's husband had drafted a formal letter to the state licensing board, laying out in careful, methodical detail every discrepancy he'd uncovered in the accounts he'd been quietly asked to manage, the same accounts that would later be twisted into forged debt with her name attached. He hadn't been the architect of anything. He'd been about to become a whistleblower, and Do-hyun had made sure he never got the chance to send that letter. Naomi sat with the printed copy in her hands for a long time that night, tracing her husband's familiar handwriting in the margins, and felt something in her chest finally settle after a year of carrying a grief tangled up with quiet, unspoken doubt. He hadn't failed her. He'd been trying to do the right thing, and it had cost him everything. Now, finally, it would cost him nothing at all, because Ruiz promised her, with the full weight of federal evidence behind him, that her husband's name would be cleared publicly, formally, permanently, alongside every dollar of debt that had never rightfully belonged to her family in the first place. That was 3 weeks ago now. The debts were gone by the following Tuesday, wiped from every record with the kind of swift, quiet efficiency that only comes when federal prosecutors have a vested interest in making a case airtight. Her medical license, which had never technically been threatened, but had hung under a cloud of uncertainty since the day she'd first read Yi-hoon's falsified chart, was fully restored with a formal letter of clarification from the state board, along with an apology Naomi hadn't expected and didn't need but appreciated anyway. And Annabelle had spent the last 3 weeks doing exactly what 5-year-olds do best after trauma nobody explained to them fully, bouncing back with a resilience that broke Naomi's heart and mended it in the same breath, more interested in the state of her toy car collection than in anything resembling the danger she'd actually survived. Today, the estate looked nothing like the house Naomi had first walked into. Every curtain that had once been sealed shut against daylight now hung open, sunlight pouring through windows that had gone unused for 7 years, spilling gold and warm across marble floors that had spent nearly a decade in shadow. Someone Kwan, Naomi suspected, though he'd never admit to it directly, had strung soft string lights along the veranda railings overlooking the estate grounds, and long tables draped in white linen stretched across a lawn Naomi hadn't even known existed on her first terrified visit through these gates. The darkness that had filled that house for 7 years vanished in a single afternoon, replaced by the sound of actual laughter echoing off walls that had forgotten what it sounded like. Yi-hoon had insisted on the celebration the moment the last piece of paperwork cleared, waving off Naomi's protests that it was too soon, too much, that they should all just rest after everything. Rest, he'd told her, in that dry, steady way he had, is something I have had 7 years of. I would like something else now. He looked like a different man entirely as he wheeled himself across the lawn that afternoon, sunlight catching against the ink climbing his forearms. Dressed simply, comfortably, none of the careful stillness that had defined him during their first weeks together. His upper body had filled back out with real strength, his shoulders squared with the particular confidence of a man who had clawed his way back from something everyone believed impossible. And though his legs still hadn't regained the full function they might one day recover, Naomi had been honest with him about that, honest the way she'd promised herself she'd always be. He moved through that celebration like a man who had already won everything that mattered. He didn't need to walk to prove he was standing tall again. Naomi watched him greet each of the elders who'd come, watched the way they addressed him now with genuine deference rather than the pitying formality of men visiting a ruin, and understood that whatever Yi-hoon reclaimed from this house, it was never really about his legs at all. Kwan stood near the edge of the lawn in a clean suit instead of his usual tactical gear, looking almost uncomfortable in the softness of the occasion, though the smile he wore whenever his eyes landed on Yi-hoon gave away exactly how he felt about how far they'd both come. Ruiz had come too, off duty for once, a beer in hand instead of a badge, standing close enough to Naomi that she suspected, though she wasn't ready to examine it too closely yet, that this particular friendship might grow into something more once enough time had passed to let it. And Annabelle was everywhere at once, the way only a 5-year-old at a party can be, darting between tables, stealing strawberries from the dessert spread, showing anyone who'd stand still long enough her latest drawing, a crayon rendering of a man in a wheelchair racing a girl in yellow overalls, both of them grinning with more teeth than anatomically possible. "Race me," she demanded finally, planting herself directly in front of Yi-hoon's chair, hands on her hips, the same posture she'd struck the very first day Naomi had found her standing fearless in a blackout bedroom. Yi-hoon looked up at her, something soft and unguarded crossing his face. "Best of 3. "Best of 10, Annabelle countered, already backing up, already counting down under her breath. They tore across the lawn together, laughter carrying loud and unrestrained across the grounds. Guards who once stood grim and silent along that same stretch of marble, now clapping and cheering from the sidelines like proud uncles at a school sports day. Naomi stood watching, one hand pressed against her chest the way it always seemed to go whenever this particular scene played out in front of her, and felt tears prick her eyes that had nothing to do with grief for once. Annabelle reached the finish line first, as she always did, though Naomi suspected by now that Yi-hoon let her win far more often than he'd ever admit, and without missing a beat, reached into the pocket of her overalls and produced the small pink plastic crown she seemed to carry everywhere these days, placing it gently on Yi-hoon's head with the same solemn ceremony she'd shown it the very first time. Annabelle put a pink plastic crown on his head, and the feared boss of the Lee Syndicate wore it with genuine, unashamed pride, sitting there in the afternoon sun, surrounded by men who had once trembled at the sound of his name, looking for all the world like exactly what Annabelle had always insisted he was, a king finally home. Naomi found herself laughing through tears she didn't bother wiping away, and when she looked up, she found Yi-hoon watching her from across the lawn, that same soft, unguarded expression on his face, the crown still perched crooked on his head, and something passed between them in that moment that neither of them tried to name out loud. Not yet. There would be time for that. There was, finally, nothing but time. She thought about the woman who had walked through those gates 7 weeks ago, terrified, drowning in debt she hadn't earned, certain she had nothing left to offer the world but her own exhausted competence. She thought about how she'd told herself, again and again, that trusting anyone with the truth of her fear was a weakness she couldn't afford. She understood now, standing on this sunlit lawn watching her daughter shriek with laughter beside a man who had once been given up for dead, that she'd had it backward the whole time. Trust hadn't been the danger. It had been the only thing that had ever actually saved her. She came to save a patient, and ended up freeing them both. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and gold over the estate grounds, and the party wound down into something quieter, warmer, Yi-hoon wheeled up beside her at the edge of the lawn, Annabelle already asleep against Naomi's shoulder, worn out from an entire afternoon of racing. 7 years, he said quietly, watching the last light fade over the hedges. I told myself there was nothing left to fight for. I was wrong about a great many things, it turns out. Naomi looked down at her sleeping daughter, then back at him, at the crown still sitting slightly crooked on his head because he hadn't once, all afternoon, bothered to take it off. She has that effect on people, Naomi said softly. So, Yi-hoon said, do you? If this story reminded you that love can find you in the darkest, most unexpected places, that a broken family and a broken man can heal each other into something whole, I want to give you more of that feeling. Stories that make you feel something has 2 full novels waiting for you, one that will break your heart wide open, and one that will heal every piece of it, love and loss and hope woven through every single page. It comes with a free audiobook and future books already included, ready for instant download right now. The link is waiting for you in the description and pinned in the comments below. And if you're curled up on your couch watching this on your TV tonight, just grab your phone, scan the QR code on your screen, and let this feeling follow you home. You've earned it. Go get your copy tonight. If Annabelle's laughter restored your faith in second chances, drop a heart below. And thank you for walking through this whole story with us.